Have you ever watched a father call his own daughter worthless at a family dinner? That's exactly what happened to me 3 days ago. In front of 20 relatives, my CEO father stood up and announced I was dead weight, a burden he'd been carrying for too long. He challenged me to survive just 1 week without the family money, without his protection, without the chamber's name. So I accepted his challenge. I placed my keys to the $3 million penthouse on the table and walked out. What Richard Chambers didn't know was that I'd been documenting his crimes for months. The trust fund he'd been stealing from, the signatures he'd been forging, the $200 million he'd illegally leveraged. 36 hours later, he lost everything. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. My name is Evelyn Chambers, and this is how I dismantled an empire with the truth. The Chambers Holdings headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, with my father Richard's corner office taking up half of the 40th floor. Every morning for 10 years, I'd arrive at 7 sharp, passing the original Monet in the lobby, a $12 million reminder of the family's success. As chief financial officer, I managed every number that mattered in our $2 billion real estate empire. Every acquisition, every quarterly report, every investor presentation went through my desk. But according to the organizational chart hanging in the boardroom, I had no voting rights. That privilege belonged to my brother Marcus, the executive vice president, whose actual contribution to the company consisted mainly of long lunches and golf meetings. My father would adjust his $400,000 Patek Philippe Nautilus before our morning briefings, the Swiss movement catching the light as he'd remind me that numbers are just support work, sweetheart. The real business happens on the golf course. I'd nod, return to my office, and continue managing the financial infrastructure that kept his empire standing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I held a CPA license and a master's in finance from Columbia, credentials I'd earned through scholarships and 70-hour weeks. Meanwhile, Marcus's Wharton MBA, fully funded by father, hung prominently in his office next to photos from his fraternity days. The Hermès briefcase I carried wasn't a gift. I'd bought it myself after closing a particularly complex merger that saved the company $40 million in taxes. Father took credit for that deal in the board meeting, of course. Marcus had presented my analysis as his own strategic vision. For 10 years, I'd been the invisible foundation holding up their golden tower. They just never expected the foundation to walk away. The pattern established itself early in our careers at Chambers Holdings. I'd spend 3 weeks preparing the quarterly financial analysis, revenue projections, market comparisons, risk assessments down to the decimal point. Marcus would spend 3 minutes presenting it to the board as his own work, stumbling over terminology he didn't understand, while our father beamed with pride. Marcus is the future of this company, Richard would announce at every opportunity, his hand on my brother's shoulder during investor dinners. The same dinners where I'd sit quietly, feeding Marcus statistics through text messages under the table when board members asked specific questions. Last quarter was particularly memorable. Marcus had developed a new investment strategy that would expand our portfolio into emerging markets. The 70-page presentation was mine, including the financial models that took 2 weeks to perfect. When Harold Morrison, our board chairman, asked about the risk mitigation protocols, Marcus froze. I watched him fumble for 15 seconds before smoothly interjecting with a clarification that saved the presentation. Richard's response? "Excellent recovery, son. Evelyn, make sure you support your brother better next time." The Wharton MBA that Richard loved to mention cost $300,000. My Columbia degree, earned at night while working full-time, cost me nothing thanks to academic scholarships. Guess which one hung in the executive conference room's wall of achievement? The most painful part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was watching Marcus believe his own myth, genuinely thinking his 2-hour workdays and liquid lunches constituted executive leadership. He'd inherited our father's jawline and confidence. I'd inherited our grandmother's sharp mind and, as I'd soon discover, her foresight. The question everyone would ask later was why I tolerated it for so long. The answer was simpler than they'd expect. Judith Chambers died in 2015, leaving behind more than just grief. My grandmother had built the foundation of Chambers Holdings alongside my grandfather, though her name appeared nowhere in the company history. Before marrying into the family, she'd been a corporate lawyer, a detail my father preferred to forget. The funeral was elaborate, as expected. 500 guests, white orchids flown in from Thailand, a string quartet playing her favorite Vivaldi. But afterward, in the lawyer's office, the real Judith emerged through her will. She'd left a $500 million trust divided among her 3 grandchildren, with Richard appointed as primary trustee. Your grandmother always believed in proper documentation, the estate lawyer had said, sliding copies across the mahogany table. Richard barely glanced at them before signing. Marcus was checking his phone, but I read every line, just as grandmother had taught me during our Sunday afternoon teas. Always keep your own copies, dear, she'd told me once. Her fingers wrapped around bone china, her eyes sharp despite her 80 years. Power isn't in titles or corner offices, it's in the fine print that nobody bothers to read. I'd smiled then, thinking it was just grandmother's way of encouraging her bookish granddaughter. That afternoon in the lawyer's office, I requested a complete copy of the trust documents. Richard laughed. What for? You don't trust your own father? The secretary made the copies anyway. I filed them in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, the same branch where grandmother had kept her own papers. It seemed sentimental at the time, keeping documents I'd probably never need in the same bank she'd used. 7 years later, those 40 pages would become the most valuable inheritance she'd left me. But first, I had to discover what my father had done. The fourth quarter board meeting should have been routine. 15 directors gathered around the polished conference table, Mont Blanc pens poised over Italian leather portfolios. I'd identified a $50 million discrepancy in Marcus's division, money hemorrhaging through shell companies he'd approved without proper vetting. There's a significant issue with the Riverside development, I began, pulling up the spreadsheets on the presentation screen. The numbers told a clear story of negligence and possible fraud. Richard cut me off mid-sentence. Don't overthink things, sweetheart. Marcus has already addressed those concerns privately. Marcus hadn't addressed anything. He hadn't even known about the discrepancy until I'd mentioned it. But he nodded sagely, playing the part of the competent executive while I stood there with 40 pages of evidence that would never be seen. Perhaps we should let the men handle the strategic decisions, Richard added, earning a few uncomfortable chuckles from the older board members. Evelyn tends to get lost in the details. Harold Morrison, our board chairman, frowned but said nothing. His eyes met mine briefly, a flash of something that might have been sympathy or disappointment. The other directors shifted in their seats, studying their portfolios with sudden intensity. I returned to my seat, my face carefully neutral while inside, something fundamental shifted. After the meeting, Harold approached me by the elevator. That discrepancy, he said quietly. Is it as serious as you indicated? More serious than you know, I replied. He handed me his business card, his personal cell written on the back. Document everything, he said, then walked away. That night, I began a forensic audit of our entire financial structure. What I found in the family trust accounts made the $50 million discrepancy look like a rounding error. External auditors were coming in 3 weeks. As CFO, I needed to prepare all financial documents, including the family trust accounts that Richard usually handled personally. He was in Aspen for a business retreat that looked suspiciously like a ski vacation, so the files landed on my desk. The first red flag appeared on page 12, a $200 million loan with the trust listed as collateral. That was illegal. Trust assets couldn't be used for personal guarantees under the terms grandmother had established. I kept reading, my coffee growing cold as each page revealed another violation. Richard had been using the trust like his personal piggy bank. Business loans, real estate speculation, even a yacht purchase in the Caymans, all backed by money that wasn't his to leverage. But the worst discovery came in the transfer documents from 6 months ago. Marcus's signature authorized moving $50 million from the trust to an investment opportunity that turned out to be a casino development in Atlantic City. Except Marcus's signature was wrong. I knew my brother's handwriting. We'd shared enough forged hall passes in high school. This wasn't even close. I photocopied everything. Then I photographed the copies. Then I uploaded encrypted files to 3 different cloud services. My hands shook as I organized the evidence into a timeline. 5 years of systematic fraud, forgery, and fiduciary breach. That's when I remembered grandmother's safety deposit box. She'd added me as a signatory the year before she died, saying she wanted someone responsible to have access. I'd never opened it, respecting her privacy even after her death. But now, sitting in my office surrounded by evidence of my father's betrayal, I heard her voice clearly. For when you need it most. Tomorrow was the family dynasty dinner. The timing felt like fate. The private dining room at Le Bernardin had been reserved for the Chambers family quarterly dinner. 20 relatives gathered around the table, crystal baccarat glasses catching the candlelight as Richard stood for his traditional toast. To the future of the Chambers empire, he began, his voice carrying that CEO authority that made board members lean forward. And to announce that Marcus will be promoted to president, effective Monday. The Wagyu beef course sat untouched on my plate as relatives applauded. Marcus grinned, accepting congratulations, while our cousins whispered their surprise. I hadn't been consulted. The CFO hadn't been informed about restructuring that would affect every financial document in the company. 30 years building this empire, Richard continued, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. And I couldn't be prouder to see my son ready to take the reins, to family loyalty above all else. 20 glasses rose. Mine remained on the table. Richard's toast continued for 5 minutes, acknowledging various family members' contributions. Our cousin James's new gallery, Uncle Robert's golf championship, Marcus's brilliant strategic vision. My name never came up. At least you have a steady job, Aunt Susan whispered to me as dessert arrived. Not everyone can say that in this economy. I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. Inside, I was calculating. The trust documents in grandmother's safety deposit box, the evidence on my laptop, the business card Harold Morrison had given me, the merger meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Marcus was laughing at something our cousin said, confident in his promotion. Richard was holding court, the patriarch in his element. Neither of them noticed me checking my phone, reading the email from Margaret Sullivan at First National Trust. Received your inquiry. We should discuss your grandmother's provisions immediately. The champagne toast was still happening when I quietly excused myself for the restroom. Instead, I made a call. If you've ever felt undervalued in your own family, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story resonates with something you've experienced, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Because what occurred in the next 24 hours changed not just my life, but the entire power structure of the Chambers family forever. Now, let me tell you about the moment everything exploded. Richard wasn't finished. As the dessert plates were cleared, he stood again, his Cartier cufflinks catching the light as he gestured for attention. The room quieted, sensing something significant coming. You know, building an empire requires difficult decisions, he began, his eyes finding mine across the table. Sometimes that means carrying dead weight for the sake of family harmony. My fingers found my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one thing of hers I wore every day. But there comes a time when even family needs to prove their worth. He was looking directly at me now. Evelyn here thinks she's indispensable, thinks her little spreadsheets and reports are what keep this company running. Marcus laughed, actually laughed. Several cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I'll tell you what real value looks like, Richard continued. It's relationships, vision, the ability to close deals on a golf course, not hide behind a calculator. Everything you have, he pointed at me, I gave you. That job, that apartment, That life you live, all of it exists because I allow it. 20 pairs of eyes turned to me. Someone was recording on their phone, probably cousin Jennifer, who live-streamed everything to her Instagram. So, here's my challenge, daughter. You think you're so capable? So independent? Go ahead, walk away. Prove you can survive 1 week without the chamber's name, without the family money, without my protection. His smile was cold. I guarantee you'll come crawling back within 3 days, begging for your little desk job. The room held its breath. Even the waitstaff had frozen by the door. I stood slowly, reached into my purse, and pulled out my keys. The penthouse, the Mercedes, the office. Each one made a distinct sound as I placed them on the marble table. You're right, Father. I should test that theory. The Hermes keychain made a small clink against the Carrara marble. That was the only sound in the room. I removed each key methodically. The penthouse on the Upper East Side, $3 million of glass and marble that had never felt like home. The Mercedes S-Class in the garage, a birthday gift that came with strings. The executive elevator fob, the private parking pass. Finally, my Chambers Holdings employee badge, the photo showing a younger, more hopeful version of myself. You're right about one thing, Father, I said, my voice steady as a quarterly earnings call. Everything I have, you gave me. So here, take it all back. Marcus's mouth hung open. Aunt Susan dropped her dessert spoon. Someone, I think it was cousin Jennifer, gasped audibly. Her phone was definitely recording, and I noticed she'd switched to FaceTime. The face on her screen looked like Harold Morrison. Richard's face had gone from smug to confused. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. I was supposed to cry, to plead, to apologize for whatever imagined slight had triggered his display of dominance. Evelyn, don't be dramatic, my mother finally spoke, her voice thin with embarrassment. I'm not being dramatic, I replied, unhooking the pearl necklace, the only thing I'd keep. I'm being practical. Father's made a valid point. I should discover what I'm worth without the chamber's name. I picked up my purse, my own purchase, from my own salary, and walked toward the door. 20 relatives watched in stunned silence. This is ridiculous, Richard called after me. You'll be back tomorrow, begging. Maybe, I said, pausing at the door. But somehow, I doubt it. The last thing I heard before the door closed was Marcus saying, she'll be back by morning. If only they knew what morning would actually bring. The Motel 6 sheets were rough, but my conscience was clear. I'd paid cash for 3 nights, using bills from my personal emergency fund, $50,000 accumulated over 10 years from birthday money, tax refunds, and small bonuses that Richard didn't know about. Money that had never touched a Chambers account. My phone buzzed constantly on the nightstand. 47 missed calls from Mother, 12 texts from Marcus, ranging from stop being dramatic to you're embarrassing the family to Dad's going to disown you. Richard's email arrived at 11 p.m. Report to the office by 9 a.m. Monday or consider yourself terminated. This childish tantrum has gone far enough. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my personal laptop, a refurbished ThinkPad I'd bought in college, and began organizing the files I'd copied. Trust documents, forged signatures, illegal loans, each piece of evidence categorized and cross-referenced. At midnight, I called Margaret Sullivan. Ms. Chambers, she answered on the first ring, despite the hour. I've been expecting your call for 3 years. You have? Your grandmother predicted this moment. She said Richard would eventually push you too far, and when he did, you'd need help. I'm the senior trust counsel at First National. We've been monitoring certain irregularities in your father's management of the trust. How bad is it? Bad enough that the board of directors should be informed. Bad enough that criminal charges are possible. Bad enough that you, as primary beneficiary, have grounds to invoke Article 7. Article 7, Independent Trustee Provision. I'd read it a dozen times but never imagined using it. There's a board meeting Monday morning, I said. A merger vote. Perfect timing. I'll need you at First National at 8 a.m. Bring everything. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Harold Morrison. By Sunday morning, the family panic had reached critical mass. Mother called every hour, her voicemails evolving from stern disappointment to barely concealed hysteria. Your father's locked himself in his study. The merger lawyers are asking questions. Please, Evelyn, just come home and apologize. Marcus sent a photo of my empty office with the caption, "Hope you enjoyed your tantrum, already moving my stuff in." But the most interesting messages came from unexpected sources. Harold Morrison texted twice. Richard claims you've had a breakdown. The board needs assurance before Monday's merger vote. Please confirm your status. 3 board members reached out privately. Jennifer's live stream of the dinner had made rounds, not publicly, but within the company's inner circle. The optics were terrible. A CEO bullying his own CFO daughter until she literally walked out. Then came the call that changed everything. "Ms. Chambers?" The voice was nervous, young. "This is Bradley from IT. I know you're not technically with the company right now, but there's something you should know. Your father asked me to delete all your access to the trust files, but, the thing is, you created backups he doesn't know about. On the subsidiary servers. Should I delete those too?" I sat up straighter on the motel bed. "Bradley, do you remember what I told you when I hired you? Always follow proper documentation protocols." "Exactly. So what does protocol say about deletion requests?" "They need to be in writing, with board approval for anything involving trust documents." "Then you have your answer." After we hung up, I smiled for the first time in days. Richard's panic was making him sloppy. Trying to delete evidence was obstruction. Margaret Sullivan would be very interested in that information. But the real panic wouldn't start until tomorrow morning. First National Bank's safety deposit box vault felt like a sanctuary. Margaret Sullivan waited as I turned the key grandmother had given me 7 years ago. Inside, along with some jewelry and old photographs, was a manila envelope marked "For Evelyn, when the time comes." The letter inside was dated 6 months before her death. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, Richard has finally shown his true nature. I've watched him dismiss your intelligence while stealing your work. I've seen Marcus receive credit for your accomplishments. I stayed silent, hoping Richard would change. He won't. The trust I created has protections Richard doesn't understand because he never read past the signature page. Article 7, Section 3. Any trustee who uses trust assets for personal gain shall immediately forfeit all management rights. The primary beneficiary, that's you, dear, with 40% stake, can invoke independent oversight. Richard thinks the trust is his to control. He's wrong. I made sure of that." Beneath the letter were original documents from 2015, including one Richard had never seen, a codicil naming me as primary beneficiary with override authority in case of fiduciary breach. Grandmother's lawyer had notarized it separately, keeping it from Richard's knowledge. Margaret examined each document carefully. "Your grandmother was brilliant. These provisions are ironclad. With the evidence you've gathered of Richard's violations, we can freeze his control immediately. What about the merger meeting tomorrow? That's where we make our move. Public accountability at its finest." She smiled, reminding me of grandmother. "Richard's about to learn what happens when you underestimate the women in his family." I thought about Richard and Marcus, probably celebrating my absence, planning their merger, confident in their power. They had no idea what was coming. Margaret Sullivan's office occupied an entire floor of First National's headquarters. As senior trust counsel, she commanded a team of 20 lawyers. 3 of them sat around her conference table, documents spread before them like battle plans. "Your grandmother retained me personally in 2014, Margaret explained. She suspected Richard would eventually abuse his position. I've been documenting irregularities for 3 years, waiting for a beneficiary to act." "Why didn't you contact me sooner?" "Without a beneficiary complaint, I had no standing. Your grandmother made me promise to wait until you came to me. She said you'd know when the time was right." The evidence was worse than I'd discovered. Richard had taken out 5 separate loans against the trust, totaling $300 million. Marcus had signed off on transfers that moved funds to offshore accounts. They'd treated the trust like a corporate slush fund. The beauty is, Margaret continued, they violated the exact provisions your grandmother highlighted. She knew her son's weaknesses, arrogance and greed. The trust documents include specific penalties for these exact violations, such as immediate removal as trustee, freezing of all trust-related assets. And here's the best part. Any business decisions made using trust funds as leverage become voidable. That includes tomorrow's merger. Harold Morrison had been copied on our filing. His response was immediate. The board needs to be informed. This is material information affecting a major transaction. Will you come to the meeting? I asked Margaret. With pleasure. Your grandmother was a dear friend. She'd be proud to see Richard finally held accountable. She paused. You realize he'll never forgive you for this. I thought about 20 relatives watching him humiliate me, about 10 years of stolen credit, about being told I was worthless. He never valued me anyway. At least now he'll respect the consequences. 10 years of financial expertise was about to pay off in ways father never imagined. I spent Sunday night in Margaret's conference room, assembling what she called the most comprehensive breach of fiduciary duty case she'd seen in 30 years. Every document told a story of systematic abuse. The loan documents were damning enough, Richard's signature authorizing the use of trust assets as collateral for his personal real estate ventures. But Marcus's involvement was what would trigger criminal investigation. 3 forged signatures on transfer authorizations, moving $50 million to accounts in the Caymans. Accounts that, coincidentally, paid for his gambling debts and his mistress's Miami condo. This email particularly interests me. Margaret highlighted a message on her screen. Richard to Marcus, dated 6 months ago. The trust is just family money anyway. Move what you need, we'll paper it later. Then there was the recording. Bradley from IT had sent me something else. Audio from the board's executive session last month. Richard explicitly discussing borrowing from the trust until the merger closes. Harold Morrison's voice asking, "Is that legal?" Richard's response, "I'm the trustee. I decide what's legal." We organized everything into a presentation, charts showing the money flow, timelines of each violation, side-by-side comparisons of real versus forged signatures. The forensic accountant Margaret brought in called it beautifully devastating. "One question," Margaret said as we finished. "Why now? You could have exposed this months ago." "He had to push me out first," I replied. "Otherwise, it would look like a power grab. Now, I'm just a concerned beneficiary protecting her inheritance from outside the company." Margaret smiled. "Your grandmother would appreciate the strategy. Tomorrow's board meeting will be very interesting indeed." The merger documents sat on Richard's desk, waiting for signatures that would never come. Sometimes real power isn't what others give you. It's what they don't know you already have. If you're following this story and feeling that connection to your own experiences, please like and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The climax is about to unfold in the place where my father felt most secure, his own boardroom. What happened next is something those board members still talk about today. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. The Chambers Holdings boardroom had never felt more electric. 15 board members filed in, their Italian suits and Rolex watches a uniform of power. The Phoenix development team occupied one side of the mahogany table, their lawyers reviewing the $500 million merger documents one final time. Richard entered like a conquering emperor, Marcus flanking him with practiced arrogance. They'd dressed for victory, Richard in his lucky Armani suit, the one he wore for every major deal. Marcus sporting new Cartier cufflinks, probably purchased with trust funds. "Gentlemen," Richard began, not acknowledging the 3 women board members. "Today we make history. This merger will cement Chambers Holdings as the largest private real estate empire on the East Coast." Harold Morrison presided from the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Before we proceed, Richard, the board has concerns about your CFO's absence. This is highly irregular for a transaction of this magnitude. Richard's jaw tightened. My daughter has taken a personal leave. Marcus has assumed her responsibilities. Your daughter, who is also your CFO, Harold clarified, who walked out of a family dinner after you publicly challenged her competence. Yes, we've all seen the video. Nervous glances around the table. Jennifer's live stream had done its work. That's a family matter, Richard said dismissively. Shall we proceed with the signing? Harold's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his eyebrows rose. Actually, we have visitors. The boardroom doors opened. Margaret Sullivan entered first, followed by two First National representatives in severe black suits. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's face went from confident to confused. What is this? We're in the middle of a private meeting, Margaret smiled. Not anymore. Mr. Chambers, you're being removed as trustee of the Judith Chambers Family Trust, effective immediately. Margaret Sullivan's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. She placed a cease and desist order on the table, the First National seal prominent on the letterhead. This is ridiculous, Richard sputtered, his face flushing red. You can't just walk into my boardroom. Actually, we can, Margaret interrupted. When trust assets are being illegally used to secure corporate deals, we have not just the right, but the obligation to intervene. The Phoenix development lawyers were already packing their briefcases. Their lead counsel whispered urgently to their CEO. The merger was evaporating before Richard's eyes. I'll have your license, Richard threatened, standing now, his hands flat on the table. This is harassment. It's a lawful intervention based on documented fiduciary breach, Margaret continued calmly. Gentlemen, ladies, I'm afraid this merger cannot proceed. The assets Mr. Chambers pledged as collateral are encumbered by trust provisions he violated. Marcus finally found his voice. You can't prove anything. Margaret smiled. Oh, but we can. Harold Morrison hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his eyes were fixed on Margaret with laser focus. Ms. Sullivan, these are serious allegations. I assume you have evidence? Extensive evidence, Mr. Morrison. Would you like to see it? The board members exchanged glances. One of them, Sandra Chen, who'd always been skeptical of Richard's methods, spoke up. I think we need to see this evidence immediately. Richard's confident facade was cracking. This is a setup. Where's this coming from? Who filed this complaint? Margaret's smile widened. The primary beneficiary of the trust, of course. She'll be joining us momentarily. The door opened again. Margaret's team transformed the boardroom into a courtroom. The main screen lit up with documents, each one more damning than the last. Exhibit A, Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in trust law. Loan documents from Atlantic Partners, $200 million, with the family trust listed as collateral. This violates Article 7 of the trust agreement. The board members leaned forward. Several pulled out phones, likely alerting their own lawyers. Exhibit B, transfer authorizations moving $50 million to offshore accounts. The screen showed Marcus's signature, then a forensic analysis. Notice the pressure points and stroke patterns. Our handwriting expert confirms these are forgeries. Marcus's face went white. Exhibit C, an email chain between Richard and Marcus Chambers. She read aloud. The trust is just family money anyway. Move what you need. Sandra Smith gasped. Another board member muttered something about securities fraud. And finally, Margaret clicked to the last slide. A recorded conversation from last month's executive session. Richard's voice filled the room. I'm the trustee. I decide what's legal. Harold Morrison's voice responded on the recording. Is that legal? The real Harold, sitting at the head of the table, stood slowly. Richard, this is beyond unacceptable. This is criminal. The Phoenix development team was already at the door. Their CEO turned back. This deal is dead, and Mr. Chambers, expect to hear from our legal team about the due diligence fraud. Richard slumped in his chair, his $400,000 watch catching the light as his hands trembled. Who filed this complaint? Who did this? Margaret glanced at the door. Why don't you ask her yourself? I entered the boardroom wearing my own suit. Not a Chambers Holdings purchase, but one I'd bought with my first bonus from a consulting project in college. Professional, understated, powerful in its simplicity. Good morning, board. Father, Marcus. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. 15 board members stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to what might have been admiration. Evelyn, Richard's voice cracked, what have you done? My fiduciary duty, I replied, taking a seat at the table, not in my usual corner spot, but in the center, directly across from him. As primary beneficiary of the Judith Chambers Trust, holding 40% of the family assets, I discovered systematic violations during a routine review. You're not even an employee anymore, Marcus protested. You can't be here. I'm here as a trust beneficiary, not an employee. When I found evidence of fraud during my final audit last week, I had an obligation to act. I placed my folder on the table. I gave you the chance to come clean at dinner, Father. You chose to humiliate me instead. Harold Morrison spoke carefully. Ms. Chambers, are you saying you discovered this after you left the company? I discovered irregularities before, but I couldn't act while employed without it appearing as a conflict of interest. You said I wouldn't last a week without the family, Father. I met his eyes. It's been 36 hours, and you've lost control of $200 million. Sandra Smith actually smiled. Motion to hear Ms. Chambers' full report. Seconded, said three voices simultaneously. Richard's empire was crumbling, and everyone in the room knew it. The foundation he'd scorned had just brought down his entire house. Harold Morrison stood, his 6'4" frame commanding absolute attention. For 20 years, he'd been chairman of this board, and I'd never seen him this angry. Richard, this is unacceptable. You've exposed this company to massive liability, violated federal securities law, and destroyed a crucial merger through your criminal behavior. Harold, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Harold's voice could have frozen water. You've been using company assets as your personal bank account. You've allowed your son to commit forgery. You've breached every fiduciary duty we entrusted you with. He turned to the board. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Richard Chambers as CEO. You can't do this! Richard stood, his face purple with rage. I built this company. With your wife's family money and your daughter's financial expertise, Sandra Smith interjected. We've all known for years that Evelyn was the real brains behind your success. We just lacked the courage to say it. The vote was called. One by one, hands raised, 13 for removal. Only Richard and Marcus voted against, and Marcus's vote didn't even count since he wasn't a board member. Furthermore, Harold continued, I move to appoint Evelyn Chambers as interim CFO with full voting rights, effective immediately. Seconded, Sandra said instantly. This vote was unanimous, even Richard abstaining in defeated silence. Harold turned to me. Ms. Chambers, we owe you an apology. We should have acted when we saw how you were being treated. Your grandmother would be proud of your courage. I don't need apologies, I replied. I need governance reform, starting with independent oversight of all trust-related transactions. Whatever you need, Harold said. Then, looking at Richard, you have 24 hours to clear your office. Marcus tried to salvage something from the wreckage. This is insane! She's destroying our family over petty jealousy. Mr. Chambers, Jr., Margaret Sullivan interrupted. I'd be very careful about what you say next. Forgery is a felony. I didn't forge anything. Margaret pulled out another document. Really? Then perhaps you can explain these personal loans totaling $5 million, all secured with forged trust documents? The room went silent. Even Richard stared at his son in shock. Marcus, Richard whispered, what did you do? They were investments. Marcus's golden boy facade cracked completely. The casino development was supposed to triple our money. Casino? Richard's voice rose. You used trust funds for gambling? It was a sure thing. My contact said. The boardroom door opened. A woman entered. Marcus's wife, Stephanie, her face carved from stone. Behind her stood a process server. Marcus Chambers? The server stepped forward. You're being served. Stephanie's voice was ice. Divorce papers. My lawyer will be in touch about the hidden debts. 5 million in gambling losses, Marcus? The affairs were bad enough, but stealing from your grandmother's trust? She looked at me. Evelyn, thank you for sending me the evidence. I had no idea how deep this went. Marcus looked between his wife and me, realization dawning. You knew about everything. I'm a forensic accountant, Marcus. Did you really think I wouldn't notice $5 million disappearing? I documented everything. Stephanie deserved the truth. Mr. Chambers Jr., Harold Morrison's voice was final. You're terminated for cause, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. 2 security guards appeared at the door. The Golden Sun's reign was over. The legal dominoes fell quickly once the board took action. The SEC will be very interested in these findings, Margaret announced, her team already preparing filing documents. Securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, forgery, we're looking at both civil and criminal penalties. Richard slumped further in his chair with each pronouncement. His Patek Philippe, that $400,000 symbol of success, looked like a shackle now. The immediate consequences, Margaret continued, addressing the board, are as follows. Mr. Richard Chambers is permanently removed as trustee. The $200 million in trust assets are immediately frozen and will be recovered. All illegal loans are void. What about the company? Sandra Smith asked. The company assets are separate from the trust. However, any decisions made using trust funds as leverage are now voidable. That includes 3 property acquisitions from the last year. Harold did quick math. That's nearly 50 million in deals that need to be unwound. Additionally, I spoke up, I've identified another 50 million in recoverable assets from Marcus's unauthorized transfers. First National has already initiated recovery proceedings. And my role? Richard finally spoke, his voice hollow. The board will decide your fate regarding the company, Harold replied. But I'm recommending you be moved to a non-executive advisory role. No signing authority, no decision-making power, a figurehead, essentially. As for the trust, Margaret added, Ms. Evelyn Chambers will serve as co-trustee with First National Bank. She'll have veto power over all distributions and investments. The numbers were staggering. 200 million secured, 50 million recovered, criminal investigations pending. The empire Richard built on stolen foundations was being reconstructed with legitimate governance. One more thing, Margaret said. The district attorney's office has been notified. Criminal charges are likely. I don't want to run your empire, Father. I just want it run correctly. The boardroom had emptied except for Harold, Richard, and me. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air, particles of the old regime literally unsettled. You destroyed everything, Richard said, not looking at me. No. I revealed what was already broken. You destroyed it yourself the moment you touched grandmother's trust. Harold intervened. Evelyn, the board wants to offer you the CEO position. I decline. Both men looked shocked. I'll serve as CFO with voting rights and trust oversight, but I'm also launching my own consulting firm, corporate governance and financial forensics. My first client will be any Chambers Holdings employee who is afraid to speak up about irregularities. You're abandoning the company? Harold asked. I'm establishing boundaries. I'll ensure the company's financial health and protect the trust assets, but I won't sacrifice my life for an organization that watched me be humiliated for years. I stood gathering my documents. Father, going forward, you'll need my approval for any transaction over $1 million. Any trust-related decision requires my signature. Any board presentation goes through my review first. You're enjoying this, Richard accused. No, I'm establishing the oversight that should have existed from the beginning. Grandmother knew you'd need boundaries. She just trusted me to enforce them. I moved toward the door, then paused. The family dinners can continue, but I won't attend unless I'm treated as an equal. That means no more toasts that ignore my existence, no more credit stolen, no more little spreadsheets comments. And if I refuse, then you'll see me only in boardrooms and depositions. Your choice, Father. The family reactions varied predictably. Mother called Tuesday morning, her voice a mixture of reproach and reluctant admiration. You could have handled this privately, Evelyn. I tried. For 10 years I tried. You watched him humiliate me at every dinner, every holiday, every family gathering. You never once spoke up. Silence. Then, I know. I was a coward. I'm sorry. It was the first apology I'd ever received from her. The cousins divided into camps. Jennifer, who'd live-streamed the dinner, sent a message. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen. Grandmother would be so proud. Aunt Susan called personally. We always knew you were the smart one, dear. Richard needed this wake-up call. Perhaps now he'll value what he has instead of what he thinks he deserves. Others were less supportive. Uncle Robert, Richard's golf buddy, sent a scathing email about family loyalty. I didn't respond. His own financial records showed he'd benefited from Richard's illegal loans. The SEC would be visiting him soon. Marcus had fled to Europe with what money he could access, leaving Stephanie to clean up his mess. She sent me flowers with a note. Thank you for the truth. Richard refused all contact. He'd moved to the guest house on the estate, unable to face the empty penthouse I'd walked away from. Mother said he spent his days staring at grandmother's portrait in his study. 3 employees from Chambers Holdings reached out privately, thanking me for exposing the toxic culture. They'd been afraid to speak up about Marcus's harassment and Richard's bullying. Now they had hope for change. I didn't destroy the family, I told Harold when he asked about the fallout. I revealed what was already broken. Sometimes that's the only way to heal. Success is sweeter when you know you earned it. Within a month, Chambers Holdings stock rose 12%. The market loved the governance reforms and independent oversight. Investors who'd been wary of Richard's autocratic style came flooding back. 3 Fortune 500 companies approached me with CFO offers. I declined them all. Instead, I launched Chambers Consulting, not using the family name for leverage, but reclaiming it on my own terms. My specialty: helping family businesses establish proper governance before they imploded. My first paying client wasn't a corporation, but a 32-year-old woman whose father ran a manufacturing empire. She'd called after reading about the Chambers Holdings scandal in the Wall Street Journal. I'm living your story, she said. Help me avoid your ending. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Tribeca, modest by Chambers standards but purchased entirely with my own money. No trust funds, no family gifts. The view wasn't as spectacular as the penthouse, but the freedom was priceless. Every Thursday, I mentored young women in finance at Columbia, my alma mater. The program grew from 5 students to 50 within 2 months. They called themselves the Grandmothers Club after I shared Judith's story. The consulting firm's second client was Chambers Holdings itself. Harold hired me to conduct a full governance review. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The company now paying market rate for expertise they'd gotten free for a decade. Richard attended the first presentation. He sat in the back, silent, his Patek Philippe notably absent. When I outlined the new oversight structure, he simply nodded. After the meeting, he left a note on my desk. Your grandmother would be proud. It was the closest to an apology I'd ever get. It was enough. 6 months later, I found one last letter from grandmother in the safety deposit box, hidden beneath the legal documents. It was sealed, marked, "Open only after you've won." My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, you've done what I could never do. Stood up to Richard with evidence he couldn't deny. I knew this day would come. Richard inherited his father's ambition, but not his integrity. Marcus inherited Richard's arrogance, but not his intelligence. You inherited my patience and my fury. I structured the trust knowing Richard would violate it. The provisions weren't to protect the money from outsiders, but from him. You were always the true heir to this empire, not because of blood or favoritism, but because you understand that power without accountability is just tyranny with a bank account. Your father will never fully forgive you, but one day he might understand. He confused fear for respect, obedience for loyalty. You've shown him the difference. The family needed saving from itself, and only someone who'd been dismissed and diminished could see clearly enough to do it. Remember, power isn't about control, it's about accountability. Documents matter more than words, and family doesn't mean accepting abuse. All my love, grandmother. I keep that letter framed in my office, next to my CPA license and the photo from the board meeting where everything changed. Clients often ask about it. I tell them it's a reminder that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the courage to demand what you deserve. The Chamber's empire still stands, stronger now with proper governance. Richard remains chairman emeritus, a title without teeth. Marcus sends postcards from Europe, never apologies. Mother and I have lunch monthly, building something new from honesty. And me? I'm exactly where I planned to be, just not how I expected to get here. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their struggle for respect. I share more stories about setting professional boundaries and standing up to toxic family dynamics every week. Comment below with your own experience. Sometimes knowing others have walked this path makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember, your worth isn't determined by those who refuse to see it.